Suppose that you have a little web application that makes a remote HTTP request to some external weather API to find out what the weather is like in London. What might the data in the response look like? Ideally, it would be something that JavaScript could use directly, like an object, but this is something we can't put directly in an HTTP response. What we can respond with instead is some text or string in an object-like notation that can easily be converted to an object once received. This is where JSON comes in. JSON is text written in the JavaScript object notation, which is where the abbreviation comes from. And like JavaScript objects, its values can consist of strings, numbers, nested objects, arrays, booleans, or the value null. The only major difference in syntax is that property names and string values must be written in double quotes. What I'd like to do in this video's example is use JavaScript to build an unordered list of famous British people based on data stored in a JSON string. This time we're going to be using a JSON string that's hard-coded in the script. We're going to leave the problem of making remote calls until another video. What I'd like to highlight about this though is that I've defined the string using this backtick symbol. We call this a template literal, and what it's allowing me to do is define a string over multiple lines. So what does this string contain? Well, it contains a single JSON object with a property called Britons. And the value of Britons is an array of objects, each of those objects having a full name property as well as a vocation property. Before we proceed, we can quickly check that this is valid JSON by copying and pasting it into a validator such as JSON-lint. Great, it's valid JSON, so let's go ahead and process it. The very first thing we're going to need to do is convert the string representation of this object into an actual JavaScript object, and we can do this using JSON.parse. As you can see from the console, the array we need is the value of the Britons property, so let's simply extract that directly. Now that we have an array, we can iterate over the objects contained within it using a for-of loop as usual. In each iteration, I want to convert the object into a newly created list element, giving the name of the person in bold, followed by some plain text that gives their vocation. Let's begin by creating that bold element using the createElement method. And then we make the name of the person the contents of that element by assigning to its inner text property. Next, we create the list element itself, and then we append the newly created bold element as its first child. We then append as its second child a text node containing the rest of the sentence. Note that we can't simply assign this part to the inner text property because that would overwrite the bold element we just added. Note also that I defined the string using the backtick symbol. It's another example of a template literal, and I'm going to exploit a feature of it that allows me to directly insert the value of an expression into a string. Okay, so the final step of the iteration is to append the newly created list element as the next child of the unordered list element. So what we need to do is uniquely identify that UL element using getElementById, and then call the appendChild method. And there you have it. We've processed some JSON that we pretended to receive from a server. But what if you want to send something back? The final thing I'd like to do is show you how to convert a JavaScript object into JSON. So suppose I want to make a request to the server to add a new British person, and I have the details of this person stored as an object. So the type of this is of course object. I can't send that in an HTTP request. I have to convert it to text first. How do I do that? I can use the method JSON.stringify. As you can see in the console, the type of new Brit is now string. And if I write its value to the console, you'll see that it's a string representation of the original object using this JSON syntax. Now in this video, I'm not actually going to make a request to a server, but if we were to do so via a GET request, the query string might look something like this. And that's it for this mini video. We introduced the JSON data interchange format, a textual representation of an object that you can use in communication with other servers. We showed how to convert a JSON string to an object using the JSON.parse method. We showed how to convert an object to a JSON string using JSON.stringify. And finally, we introduced template literals for defining strings over multiple lines and in which you can directly insert the values of different expressions. See you next time.